Today I'll be teaching you how to draw sine and cosine graph without using a calculator. So first you need to understand the basic sine and cosine graph and how it looks like. So let's say our y equals to sine x and y equals to cosine x. So first let me just draw the axis. So this would be 360 degrees or 2 pi if you want to write it in radian mode. So your sine graph would look like that, and sine graph always start from the center, whereas your cosine graph would start from the amplitude. So now let's talk about negative sine and cosine graph. So if y equals to negative sine x and y equals to negative cosine x, your sine graph would go down and then move up. And as for your cosine graph, it goes up and then moves down. As you can see, the negative graph is just flipped along the x-axis. Now that we know the basic, we can move on to more complicated graph. So the number in front of your sine and cosine is your amplitude, and this determines the height of your maximum and minimum point. And the number next to your x is your period, which determines how many cycles you have, and your c is the vertical shift in your graph. So now let's talk about amplitude. Like I said, amplitude determines the height of your maximum and minimum point. So let's say our y equals to 4 sine x and our y equals to negative 7 cosine x. Okay, so our amplitude is 4. So that means the maximum and minimum point is 4. So you have to mark it on your graph. And here our amplitude is negative 7, so our graph will go from down to up and then down. And our maximum and minimum point is 7 and negative 7. So now let's talk about the period. So we have y equals to sine 2x and y equals to cosine 4x. So I'm gonna make this graph in degree and this one in radian. So to calculate our period, you would have to do 360 over 2, which is 180. So our first cycle ends at 180. So when you draw it, it will look like that. As you can see, there's 2 cycles. And your maximum and minimum point is still 1 and negative 1 because there's an invisible 1 right in front of sine x. Over here, our period is 4. So to calculate that, I would do 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. That means our first cycle ends at pi over 2. So that's pi over 2, that is pi, and that is 3 over 2 pi. So in total, we have 4 cycles. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Our maximum and minimum is 1 and negative 1 because there's an invisible 1 in front of cosine. Now let's talk about the vertical shifts. So let's say our y equals to 3 sine x minus 2 and our y equals to cosine of 3x plus 3. So the vertical shift just changes the center of the graph. So our center is negative 2. So I'll draw a dotted line. And our amplitude is 3. So 3 units up and 3 units down. And then when you just draw your graph, it will look like normal, except your maximum and minimum point has become 1 and negative 5. And now for this graph, our center is positive 3, so I'll draw a dotted line again. And our period is 3. So that's 360 divided by 3, which is 120. So our first cycle would end at 120, and this is 240. The amplitude is 1, so that's 2 and 4. So this is your first cycle, your second cycle, and your third cycle. And that is how you draw sine and cosine graph without using a calculator.